Hello, welcome back to the Gregorian Conversations podcast. This week we are visiting with my old friend, President Webb. President Webb, how are you?
I'm well, and you could call me Peter Webb, and that would be just fine, or Peter, or
Okay.
Knucklehead.
I was just about to ask.
Yeah,
That's how I've always known you.
well,
Um, yeah, Peter Webb was in the church in the stake presidency when I was a little boy, and that's where we met. I've known him through the years, and I'm still. I told you this last time. I still feel like the little kid who came up at the end of each stake conference and gave you a big hug.
well,
That was-
the hugs were always appreciated, and we can still do that as adults.
yeah, we just have to um, align ourselves geospatially
Yes,
for
yes.
it to occur. But yeah. Um, okay. So I usually start with the beginning because it's a good place to start.
Okay.
So tell me about what is one of your first memories?
Interestingly enough, kneeling beside my mother and saying a prayer,
Yeah.
having her help me pray, and
How
that's an old memory.
how old do you think you were at the time?
Probably about 3.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's a
I have
good
some
first.
faint memories from those days, but that's one of them.
Yeah. Any others that come to mind?
Is some people may not believe this, but I actually remember my 3-year-old birthday party.
Yeah.
My mother went through a lot of effort to bake small cakes and then decorate each one of them as a railroad car and then lay them all out on a table as a train. And and as we partied, and I don't remember much about the party, at the end, each of the kids got to take a train car home with them.
A a train ake
Train car cake, yes,
car.
yeah, one of
Oh,
the cake cars, I guess I could call it.
so did you get a train car for that birthday?
Of cake or just train?
No, a regular one. I'm thinking maybe the cake was foreshadowing a present.
No, it didn't foreshadow a train related present, but the next day there was a swing set in our backyard.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Um, and where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Brigham City, Utah, um, north of Salt Lake, and we lived there until I was 7. My father worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He was a teacher and later a principal at the Intermountain Boarding School for Navajo students in Brigham City. And so he was transferred when I was a 7-year old, and we moved to the White Mountain Apache Reservation in northeastern Arizona. And then we moved to Albuquerque when I was 11, going on 12.
Tell me about the Apache Reservation.
Um, in those days, there was a lot of poverty. I think there still is today. There have been efforts to change circumstances, though. There, uh, there was a little sort of a compound of government housing and offices that were mostly Forest Service and Bureau of Indian Affairs related work. And
Is
then
that
there
where you
was,
lived?
pardon me?
Is that where you lived?
Yeah, that's where we lived. And then around the community were mostly wickiups and little clapboard houses made from sawmill ends that many of the natives lived in. and the first efforts were being made to create some housing for them. A more traditional home and plumbing and water and heat and all the other
Yeah.
things.
So it wasn't Adobe?
No,
No.
this was beautiful pine forests, so it was easy to have ponderosa pine as a building resource for them, and or
Oh,
they would use native grasses and things to make shade and or wiki ups.
okay. Um, Having been in New Mexico all my life, I'm just used to the Adobe uh, houses when it
Yeah,
comes to Native
which I think
American.
is probably more of a Pueblo type tradition than say the Apaches.
What? Uh, so Navajos are Pueblo. What?
Well, Navajos aren't Pueblo, but they
They're
did build with logs and mud and rocks and those kind of things so they could make hogans.
okay.
And Apaches, of course, a little bit different climate that they end up settling in. Oftentimes had um, more like grass related type houses like wiki
Right.
ups and
And
and or as they use traditional lumber than lumber to build little houses.
in the Apache, they had a more fierce warrior like quality to their history.
Seems to be, yeah, they were a little more nomadic. I think that it took them a longer time to sort of settle with the government about reservations, and frankly, I think they've got a lot of beautiful property as a
Yeah,
consequence of being a holdout, and and sweet people. I mean, it was a nice place to grow up in terms of the people around us and the little community. I think everybody knew who we were as a little kind of tow-headed Webb kids, and
yeah.
in fact, our neighbor next door was a Navajo man married to an Apache woman, and he called us the Little Red Webbs because we tended to wear these little red sweatshirts as we were out playing.
Ah, okay, awesome. And so how many years did you spend there?
We were there for almost 5 years, 4.5, 5 years.
And what is a story that really sticks out to you from that period? Some kind of adventure. Uh,
Well, we lived in the mountains of Arizona, and so there were rivers and creeks and hilltops and mesas, and so it was easy to just leave our community, our house and little compound we were in, and go hike up the hill right beside the place and have an adventure. Two
yeah.
of my friends, one was named Dennis Nez, the other's name was Michael Lacapa. So Dennis and Michael and I went one day when I was small and hiked up to a spot on the side of the mountain beside our community that everybody called the Red Spot. It was a spot of clay where nothing really grew very well. And I actually think that people had, for probably a long, long time, mined clay from there for pottery or other things. So we
Okay.
hiked up to the red spot, and there was kind of a high point on the top of it, and I got up on that, and my two friends were lower than me, and one of them tossed a dirt clod up at me, and I thought, well, this is kind of like a Book of Mormon story. These guys are
Samuel
throwing,
Canaanite?
yeah. I began to think that you got these guys throwing, and they would use yucca, broke off yucca tops for spears. They're throwing dirt clods and spears up at me, and none of them, of course, were hitting me. And I'm feeling more and more bold, and I began to cry out, "I am Samuel the Lamanite, and your spears and your stones can't hurt me." And of course, that taunted them. And the irony of it in hindsight now is here's these two little Lamanite boys, two Native American boys,
Right.
and I'm not Samuel the Lamanite. But In slow motion, I watched Dennis Nez throw a dirt clod that arced up over my head and smacked me right in the forehead, and humbled me literally and physically to the bottom of the red spot. And but that's a memory. Same friends we had. In our community there were some, semi-tame donkeys that roamed the hillside, and people used them for burden animals of burden to carry stuff, and then they
Hmm.
just let them roam and feed themselves. And anyhow, we got a hold of one of these donkeys one day and got a rope around his neck, and we decided that the three of us could ride him. And we all climbed up
At
on
the
this
same
poor little,
time.
yeah, at the same time. We all climbed up on this poor little guy with a good sized stick, and I don't remember who was in the front, but one would whack him on the side of the head to try to turn him and steer him, and then they'd pass the stick back to the one on the back that would whack him on his buns, and he just stood there. And all of a sudden, in one giant shudder, all three boys are laying on the ground, and the donkey was gone in a whirlwind. I think he just had enough of us.
Yeah. How big were you at the time?
Oh, I moved there in the second grade and moved away, and kind of toward the end of sixth grade, just
Yeah.
so those ages right in there,
Right.
7 to almost 12.
Awesome. So uh after that you said you moved to Albuquerque?
Yeah, my mother and father, um, I think, well, we appreciated the life we were having on the reservation, and it was close to my father's family. My dad grew up in northeastern Arizona. Um, they were looking for more opportunity for the kids, so my dad had an opportunity to have a promotion and moved to Albuquerque, and so we transferred to Albuquerque.
And
And
how
so I
old
finished
then?
finished my last few months of elementary school, sixth grade, in Albuquerque, and then went to junior high school and high school in Albuquerque.
Wait, they called sixth grade elementary school?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sixth grade was essentially first through, or elementary was essentially first through sixth grade.
It didn't include kindergarten?
I don't remember that it did. I think kindergarten in those days was kind of optional for a family.
Oh. And then junior high was just seventh and eighth, or did
Seventh,
it
eighth, and ninth.
ninth?
Yep. And I went to Madison Junior High School, now Madison Middle School. I would walk there. We lived far enough away to ride the bus, but it was funner to walk with your friends to and from school, and hang out and laugh and talk. And so I
Yeah.
walked to junior high school every day.
Um, and where in Albuquerque were you?
Generally, the intersection of Candelaria and Wyoming
Okay.
on Utah Street. That was our street.
So when when did you move to Rio Rancho? Or are
Well,
you're in Bernalillo?
we're in Rio Rancho. Our home's in Rio Rancho, but we I'll kind of give you the circle. When
Okay.
we finished college, which is another story about how we were led here, we ended up in Albuquerque, and after 2 or 3 years, we moved to Algodones, New Mexico, so north of Bernalillo, about 4or 5 miles, and we ended up building a home out there later and raising kids there. And that's when I was serving in the Albuquerque Stake Presidency when you were a boy.
In
And then
Algodones.
Algodones, which was a marvelous place to raise a family. Um, and then we moved to a home that's right on the edge of Bernalillo and Rio Rancho, in the Rio Rancho municipality, kind of by the Sandoval County Courthouse. and we've lived here for 20 plus years now.
Okay. So yeah, going back in time then. Um, after, well, so in high school,
Hmm.
uh, what electives did you pursue? Did you take? What classes?
You know, I've got to admit that high school for me was more of a social endeavor than it was an educational experience. I mean, I received an education, but I enjoyed being there with the other kids and having high school experiences. The other thing was that I became focused on the music of the day, and I spent a lot of time looking at and listening to albums and reading liner notes, and later deciding to play the guitar and saving my money and buying a guitar and practicing and hanging out with other guitar players, and so that kind of became the the other part of my high school years.
Yeah. In what kind of music was that?
I think in those days you would call it. I mean, there was of course traditional, or what we call classic rock nowadays, which I enjoyed. But I think if there was a genre, it would be what we would call country rock.
Okay. Awesome.
Sort of,
Um,
sort of the genre that the Eagles grew out of, and the band Poco, and some of those kinds of bands and music.
um, you graduate from high school,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, uh, what was your first job? That was probably during high school.
No, it was actually on the reservation. When
Okay.
I My brother had the paper route in our town for the Arizona Republic, and of course, it always generated some income for him. And he also had an Arizona Republic paper rack in front of the local gas station trading post. So he always had a lot of dimes, and for me that was impressive. And
Yeah.
so we had the Tucson papers came, and one of the representatives said they wanted to put some racks at the trading post, but they needed somebody to take care of them. So I, at 10 years old, became the Tucson Star and the Tucson Citizen paper boy in White River, Arizona, and all I had was paper racks. And when the Arizona Republic representative came around to collect from my brother and make sure things were in good order, I told him one day, I want an Arizona Republic paper route. And he said, well, we only have one. And I said, what if we could make two? He said, if you can get 35 people to subscribe to the paper, you can have the paper route. So I went to the edge of the community where we lived. My brother's papers were all kind of in the compound. I went to all the homes around the compound and subscribed 35 new paper recipients, and at 10 years old had an Arizona Republic paper route and the Tucson Star and Citizen racks. And I thought I was rich.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're when you're young, it doesn't take much money for
No,
you to think you're rich.
yeah.
Uh,
Then when we moved to Albuquerque, I got a Albuquerque Tribune paper route and did that until I was about 14, and then I started taking other jobs. I worked for a man for a while on construction, and I worked for Circle K at the time as a stalker in their stores. Um, I later, in high school, worked in Tom McCann's shoe store and was a shoe salesman. And in the summers, I would work jobs. I worked at, when I was 14, going on 15, I worked in Wyoming in the Bighorn Basin for my uncle who had a farm and ranch there. And then the next year, I worked in the Rexburg, Idaho area, Sugar City, for another farmer, mostly doing irrigation and farm labor there. Worked as a landscaper. I mean, work was never a problem for me. I enjoyed working, and I enjoyed the resources that it brought with it. So
Yeah.
I did lots of different things.
So, tell me about your mission.
Um, Let me start earlier than my mission.
Okay.
As a boy, my father was a returned missionary. My grandfathers had served missions. My grandfather Webb and my grandmother as a senior couple, and then my grandfather as a young man, my grandfather Klingler. Anyhow, to make a long story short, there was always the presumption in our home that you were going to go on a mission, and I never bucked that. It seemed like that would be the case. Um, so back to my story. When I was, I don't, I'm going to guess certainly I was younger than 7, and we lived in Brigham City, and we lived around the street from our chapel. And in those days, sacrament meeting was in the evening. It typically started at 5 or 5:30, I think, for most boards, and it was an hour and a half long. And so when sacrament meeting was over, it was always the beginning of one of the Sunday evening TV programs, Wild Kingdom of Omaha or Walt Disney or Bonanza or one of those shows were on. And we always wanted to hustle home so we could have some supper and see if we could watch one of those shows. One night in our sacrament meeting, in my young memory, there was this tall man in a dark suit who was talking about his mission. In hindsight, I now realize he was reporting on his mission, which was to the southern states. And he droned on and on and on. And of course, I'm hoping for sacrament meeting to end so I can hustle home. And and all I could remember feeling at the time was his mission made me nervous. It was like it didn't seem to be a happy experience for him, and it certainly wasn't being translated that way to me as a young boy. So as sacrament ended, I asked my mom, "Can I run home?" She said, "Sure." I'm running through the dark from our chapel to our home and thinking to myself, I hope I never go on a mission to the southern states. And lo and behold, when it was time to make a choice to serve a mission, and I had concluded that was what I was going to do, I had an experience where I had a dream one night that I was a missionary. It was after at the end of my first year of college, and I dreamed that I was a missionary in a white shirt and slacks, and I was standing next to a companion, and it was humid and hot, and I was filled with joy. I had never had a more joyful feeling. And I thought to myself, I had the presence of mind to think in my dream, I need to remember where this is. So I looked around me and saw a little white church set back in the trees down the road from where we stood. And then woke up, and the Spirit whispered to me, Georgia. And I thought, Georgia, that can't be.
Right.
And nevertheless, within probably a couple of months, I had a mission call to the Georgia Atlanta mission, which included, at those points, parts of Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. And about a year later, I had that experience. That little chapel was the chapel for the Society Hill branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the companion was a companion that I still know and love. And
That's
so
awesome.
I think I don't know exactly why you have those kinds of experiences, and not everybody does. For me, I think it was the Lord's way of confirming to me that He knew me. He knew exactly where I could go and be, even in this little spot of a place in South Carolina, and that it was all important to me and to His plan.
Right. Yeah, he was aware of your um, disposition toward the South and was uh, reassuring you.
Yeah,
I guess,
and
in a way.
the truth of the matter is, I loved my service in the South. It couldn't have been sweeter. So, my little boy perceptions were certainly wrong
Yeah.
about how it would end up. Yeah.
All right. Um, so you get off your mission. What's the next adventure? College?
Well, when I was a missionary, I was I was really focused on just trying to be a good missionary, and then I thought I'd come home and go to college. But when I thought about those things, it was typically, well, I'll go back to Rick's college where I'd been for a year, or I may go to the University of New Mexico. And but I hadn't given it a lot of serious thought because I sort of felt like that would come. But I had an interview with my mission president one evening, probably a couple of months before I came home, and he asked me what my plans were, and I said, I'm just trying to focus on being a good missionary, and I figure all that'll come together. He said, no, I think you need to make some plans. So he gave me a great piece of advice. He says, you go home tonight, kneel by your bed, and ask your Father in heaven what he wants you to do. And soon you'll have an impression. And then you act on your impression. And if I need to help you, let me know. So I did exactly that. And I did have an impression. I had a number of impressions, but one was that I should go to BYU, which I had never thought that I would do. Um, and so I made an application to go to BYU and was accepted. And of course, I had a girl that I was sweet on before I went on my mission, and that gave me an opportunity to pursue that relationship. And she's
You
my
live
wife.
in Utah.
Yeah.
Your wife?
Yep. Yeah. That turned into our marriage. And that was a good experience, BYU.
Yeah. Um, tell tell. Do you remember your first date?
I do. What wasn't a great experience.
No.
No, I just, I, I, I maybe should not have picked as formal a date, but it was ask a girl to homecoming, and it just seemed awkward the whole evening. And it's a girl that I became great friends with, but it it was just it somehow just didn't fit well. Um, and I had the opportunity to
Gives
date her
me a
again at
little
other
hope.
times. Pardon me?
That gives me a little hope
Oh, yeah,
because I've certainly been on some awkward dates, and uh, yeah,
yeah,
mostly
and
because I was anxious the whole time because of my OCD.
well, and I don't know that it's just OCD. I think that that's a normal feeling about trying to go out and get to know somebody.
Right.
But but I
OCD is just a big magnifying glass of when it comes to emotions. So,
probably a great way to describe that. Well done. When I did date in high school, it was pretty casual. We went to go find we would have dates, but usually it was with other kids and
yeah,
ways to go hang out and those kinds of things.
right. Okay. Um, so tell me about when you proposed.
Well, it was pretty quickly after I was back from my mission and back in school and finding an opportunity to hang out with Laurie every chance I could. I began to have these really strong feelings that I tried to bank a little bit. I thought, I'm not prepared to marry. I don't have a job. I'm going to school. Well, I had a job as a janitor for BYU, but it barely supplied me enough income for groceries and uh, and I was teaching Sunday school, and I had people I was home teaching. I mean, I was trying to do all the things I ought to do,
Hmm.
but I began to have this feeling that something was out of place. So one night I hiked away from the apartments that we lived in, where there were it was kind of on the edge of an orchard and farm area. And I hiked down into this irrigation ditch where I could sit on a culvert, and I was sure nobody could see me there in the dark. And I was having my prayers, and I said, Heavenly Father, I feel like I'm somehow out of kilter. I'm trying to do all the right things, but something doesn't feel right. And all of a sudden I had this impression, and it was because you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And I thought to myself, well, what am I supposed to do? And the impression was, get married. And all of a sudden it opened this door, that I'd been trying to shut wider. I was, yeah, I could marry Laurie and be totally happy. And I think we could figure this out. So we ended up choosing to marry. And so I worked full time and went to school full time after that. And by the time we were done, and we got her finished too. So when we were first married, she had some little bit of schooling to finish, and then we had two little kids along the way, and just made it work. And we're totally blessed by the process. Poor as church mice, but happy as could be. And in the meantime, it was, it really seemed like it piled on in some ways, because we're married, going to school full time, working full time, was called to be the elders quorum president in my ward, and then later a counselor to the bishop. And it was.
Which your son is now.
Yes, that's right. My son is a counselor to the bishop. So all of those things were really foundational in terms of things I learned and experienced about
Yeah.
not just college, but life and how to
Right.
balance things.
So it, it was just two kids, Seth and Clay.
No, the older kids, it was Burr and Courtney, were the two that we had when we were in school. And
Okay.
then later we moved to Albuquerque, and we had McKay, Clay, Seth, and Jed. That would be the four that got added on to the family here.
So you have six
Yes.
children. Okay. Um, any memories that really stick out from parenting?
Probably a lot of them, but one that would be probably apropos, because I think it's true of so much in life for lots of parents and kids. Our youngest son was what I'll call sweetly spoiled. He was, the littlest one. People catered to him. When he was 5, we found out that he had a brain tumor, and we had all the surgery and protocols and stuff we went through with that. But anyhow, one day I was trying to give him a little direction, as a father would, and he kept telling me no. I said yes, and that was me, why? And I'm getting frustrated, and finally I said, because I'm the boss. And he looked at me real innocently, and he goes, no, 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 Dad, no, you're not. And I said, then who is? And just as sweet as could be, he says, Mom. I said, well, what am I? He goes, you're just a dad. and that's been true in a lot of ways.
All right.
Laurie's the boss, and I'm just a dad.
Well, it's a good, just a thing to be.
Yeah, it is. And I've enjoyed being a husband and a father. It's
Yeah.
probably the sweetest thing in my life.
Um. So, what did you end up doing career-wise?
Well, that goes back to my interview with my mission president and my praying beside my bed. One of the
Okay.
impressions I had very clearly was that I should declare a major in child development and family relations. Now, that seems odd, because I'd had a child development and family relations class when I was a freshman at Rick's, but I took the class because it seemed that those classes were always filled with cute girls. And seemed like it could be an easy grade for a social sciences part of my degree. So anyhow, I here I have this impression, and then that wasn't the rest of it. Was if I did so if I did study child development and family relations, I had this impression it would lead me to my chosen vocation. So that's exactly what happened. I mean, as I said, I applied to BYU. I got in. I declared a major in child development and family relations with the family relations emphasis, and probably wasn't more than a year into school when the coursework led to a new degree that BYU had, and it was in financial planning and counseling. And so as I took that coursework, it just clicked with me. And so I graduated with 2 degrees, one in child development and family relations with a family relations emphasis, and then a degree in financial planning and counseling. And I've always worked as a financial advisor.
Okay. Um, um, t- Tell me a little bit more about your faith experiences, your relationship with God, and
You know, I think most people have to sort that out. They may not understand when God is trying to speak to their souls, even when they're little. I can
yeah,
look back as an adult to experiences I had as a child and realize that I was being taught in a heavenly way. Um, to give you an example, um, in our town in Brigham City, for many years, the stake president was Lorenzo Snow, who was also an apostle and had a family there in Brigham City. And and so one day in primary, and I don't know how old I'd have been, certainly 5 or 6, or maybe just barely 7, but I think it was 5 or 6. I We had a lesson about prophets and apostles, and primary used to be middle of the week on a Wednesday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We'd all go to the church and have primary and then go home. And my teacher, Sister Larson, taught us about apostles and prophets, and then said that we had a prophet that had lived in our town, and he was buried in our cemetery. Well, I lived across the street from the cemetery. And in fact, we used to play there. It was a beautiful place. And I began to think about that, and I thought, well, I want to go find that. And so I asked my mom sometime later if I could have permission to walk over to the cemetery. And I went wandering through the graves, and in my little boy mind presumed if he was the prophet, he had to be important. And if he was important, maybe he had a really big gravestone. So I'm busy looking at all the tall ones. And I come to an obelisk on a base, and I sounded out the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was on the bottom of it, and then SNOW, snow. And I realized I'd found the grave. The part I can't explain well because it's hard to say things that sometimes the Spirit teaches you in spirit language was that then I had this impression, and more than an impression, a feeling that came upon me that that was absolutely the truth. He was a prophet, and that there were living prophets and apostles in the world, which I had just learned in primary. But it came as a conviction, and
yeah,
um, and so later, even when when you question lots of other things and try and find your way, there's never been a question for me that there are not those who are the Lord's servants who lead and direct His kingdom on the earth. From the time I was a little boy to today, I know that.
yeah.
One of the other ones that I would say came as kind of a formative experience as a very young person. These would both be pre-baptism. My dad was working on a master's degree, and so he taught school during the day, and then in the mid to late afternoon, he would drive from Brigham City to Logan to go to Utah State and work on his master's degree. And somewhere in that process, my mom became sick, and my two older siblings were in school. So on some afternoons, my dad would take me with him, and I'd go sit beside him in a lecture hall. But anyhow, one afternoon, and I'm sure it was inspired, um, he drove to the temple and parked on the hillside that would be the south and kind of the south side of the temple block. And I'm a little guy, he kind of tucks me up real close beside him, and he talks to me about the temple, how it's the house of the Lord, and that I had relatives that had helped build it, and that it was a sacred place, and that he and my mom had been married in a temple so that they could be married forever and have their children forever. And then he said to me, someday you will fall in love. When you do, you should only come to the temple so that you can be married to your wife forever and have your children forever. Well, the, the explanation was probably simpler and better than that, but but what stuck into my mind were those impressions and a feeling that that was absolutely so. And so I always knew that at some point in my life, when it was time to make a choice to have a companion and be a family, that would start in the temple. And I always thought it would be in the Logan Temple, but it was under renovation when we were married, so we were married in the Salt Lake Temple.
Awesome. Um, Speaking of temples, um, I believe you were in the stake presidency when they announced the Albuquerque temple.
That's correct.
Tell me about that.
Um, well, the brethren had contacted President Hatch, our stake president, to, and the local mission president at the time, to organize uh, a tour, I guess is the way you describe it, the opportunity to see some properties with President Hinckley. And to prepare for that, President Mott and I were sworn to confidentiality, but understood that they were looking for a temple site. And so we began to do what we could do to be helpful and make sure that was organized. And President Hinckley did come to town with the local stake presidents and the mission president. They went to some predetermined locations, including the temple site we have now, or that the temple's built on. And they concluded then that should be the temple site. He concluded that should be the temple site. And so then it was kind of one of those best kept secrets. You knew that they were working on it, but couldn't share. It was wonderful when it could finally become public knowledge.
Yeah, and didn't it came out, the news came out in a different way. It seemed that,
Yeah,
like,
typically the church had
yeah,
announced. Yeah, sorry about that. The church had announced in the past that a temple would be built and where. This time they decided to determine to announce it to the local press and members of the church before they announced it to the full church in conference that next day or two. And so it felt more personal, more intimate, and I think it helped the community recognize that that it was something that was special.
yeah, and that was that the first time that they took that tactic?
I believe it was. And they also, because there had been misinformation and misunderstanding at other times in other places, they also made sure that they had the property tied up in advance, I mean, purchased, and that the zoning issues were not going to be a big problem. And they made a real effort to actually take some very beautiful brochures or brochure and photos and visit with all the neighbors within so many blocks of the temple about what a temple was, and photographs of temples, and even information with regard to property values and traffic, and what would happen if a temple was in your neighborhood.
Was that in advance to the announcement?
No, it was after the fact. Yeah.
Um, so they announced that on April 1st.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember what year, but I was staying at my friend's house. My parents were out of town,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was at James Harper's,
Uh-huh.
and uh, his sister Kay came in that day and told us, and we both kind of were just like just blown away and not sure what to think because it it happened on April 1st. And so the first question we asked was, is this an April Fool's joke?
Yeah.
Like, no. Are you sure? Just
I think they were trying to get in the news cycle the day before conference when President Hinckley could announce it also to the church. But they wanted the local members and local community to know about it first.
yeah. And so that's I think clearly not the way they do things today,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Um but yeah, I just remember having that interesting introduction to it and just
Yeah.
being like an April Fool's thing. And then I got excited, and at the time I was home teaching companions with President Mott. And so I
Mm-hmm.
got all excited and I called him and it's like, did you hear?
And he'd
Like,
already known about it for some time.
yeah. So were you and he part of the group when President Hinckley took President Hatch out to look at the sites, or
No,
did you?
it was the local stake presidents. So it was President Hatch and um, I think President Grossarth, and I don't remember the presidents at the time,
Yeah.
and and the mission president, who I think was President Kelly at the time.
Okay. But you guys like went before and came up with sites that you thought were good
Well,
options?
the
Or,
church had actually gone ahead and worked with some local real estate folks to gather information about options. And then I
okay.
think they asked the local priesthood leaders their impressions about where it could be.
Okay.
One of the sites that they looked at sort of cursorily, for example, is where the stake center for the West Stake is now, and right on the corner there of Golf Course Road and whatever the other street is. But that was a site that the church already owned because they anticipated building a chapel, but
Yeah.
they also became a possibility for a temple site. But the site they chose is perfect. It's against the mountains in many
Yes.
ways. Has broad, expansive views and it's visible. I can even see it from my backyard, and I'm clear out, on the edge of Rio Rancho and Bernalillo. But if I orient myself right in the evening, I can see the reflection on the temple south of me,
Right.
miles
Yeah.
and miles away.
We grew up in Rio Rancho, and my dad had a telescope, and he could always find the temple in the
Mm-hmm.
telescope.
Yeah.
So
But
yeah,
it's not a bad thing to orient yourself to the temple. And
no,
there's a
it's
whole
not.
lot of implications in that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, what life experience has caused you to trust most in God?
Um, it's not just one, it's many.
Yes.
And um, boy, that's a great question. I'd have to try to winnow it down to those that are the most important. But
Yeah. What kind of struggles have you had that he's helped with? If you, that you feel
well,
comfortable talking about?
you know, I think I had probably a pretty typical teenage type experience. I, I don't know that I ever really questioned about the church
No.
until until I kind of distanced myself from church, and then there's all these questions. But as a high school student, as I said, I'm focused more on probably the sociality of high school than anything else, and music. I found myself, you know, playing music and going places and hanging out with people that, um, they had different opinions about what was good and what wasn't good, and and whether you admit it or not, with the best of intentions, you think, well, I don't need to do those things, but there becomes an erosion to your sensibilities.
Yeah.
So, in high school, late in high school, as a senior in high school, I I began to, I don't know if it was really question, but it was, hey, I'm getting closer to mission age and other things, and these are things I really want to do. And but I had a really good bishop, and who was a friend and a bishop, and he could be real frank with us. And then I got sick for a number of weeks in my senior year of high school, which, in hindsight, really humbled me. Um, and and after like 3 weeks of being at home and not being able to go to school and losing weight, and I had a kidney infection that they couldn't quite solve, and I'd had the flu on top of that, and a sinus infection on top of that, and my dad had asked me, "Would you like a blessing?" And and actually, I began to wonder if I was really worthy of a blessing. I believed in blessings, but I believed too that I needed to be a more worthy recipient of a blessing, and I was had been a doubter, and I was. So I told him, no, not now. But the sickness just persisted, and I just felt pitiful. And one day I woke up and thought, why wouldn't you receive a blessing? So I told my dad, I'd like a blessing. Ask Brother Guthrie to please, who is our home teacher, please come help you. And they administered to me, and there wasn't a quick change. I'd think in my heart of hearts, I hoped for a miracle. But in 2 or 3 days, there began to be this real subtle change. It was like I bounced off the bottom somewhere. And at a doctor's appointment with my mom, where they were looking at my infected kidney and x-rays, I heard the doctor say, if we can't clear this up, we may have to take that one, which scared me. So we went back the next week for a new round of x-rays, and they were clear. And that's when I kind of bounced off the bottom. I could feel that there was a change in momentum. And as we walked out of the doctor's office, my mom had me by the elbow because I was quite feeble. And she turned to me and she said, "Peter, I hope that that's a lesson for you." And it was. I was so surprised about these clear x-rays, and the fact that I was beginning to feel better. And I
Yeah.
and I came to a realization that I had been healed. I was healed. That God loved me enough, in spite of how I might have seen myself, that He was willing to give me blessings He could extend to other people. And so I learned an important lesson there.
All right.
Um,
So I have one question to wrap up, but before I ask that, can you think of anything that I haven't asked that you think would be important to cover, or that you just want to say?
um, yeah, I think, if I could say it kind of simply, I know that there are numbers of people in the church, and it has always been. It's not just a modern phenomenon, but it may be maybe a bigger issue now, who have what they would call a crisis of faith. the truth of the matter is that we've come here to learn by faith, and it may always be a crisis. That's how we learn to know and love God, and we know that He loves us. But when you talk to folks about that and remind them that there really are ways for us to be able to extend our faith and increase our faith, and certainly for me, every time I read in the Book of Mormon, I feel light and truth. It's a salve for the world around me. I try to read in it every day, and yet I have had people say, "Oh, don't give me the primary answers, scriptures, and go to church and say your prayers." But that's why they are the primary answers, and I think they mean primary, like primary program at church. But if you look at it in terms of primary or foundational, those are the things that we learn truth and light from. When we humble ourselves and get on our knees and just ask the Lord to please speak to our souls, He may not immediately at that moment, but He does not turn away from that request. And He'll begin to open doors and find ways to speak to you and me in ways that we understand. And that's true not only from our prayers, but if we go to the scriptures and see what the prophets and apostles have taught through the ages, as we find opportunities to worship, and maybe, it's just sitting and listening, but trying to find how God's going to speak to us. The primary answers are critical. Those foundational type things are what helps us to find God and allows us to realize that He has love and an interest for us. So that would be my simple explanation.
Okay. And if you could send one message 100 years into the future for your posterity to hear, what would it be? What you just said?
I would say trust Jesus. Trust on, hope on. There really is a God who knows and loves us, whose only begotten Son loves Him so much and loves us so much that He was willing to be the everlasting sacrifice for us so that justice could be served and His perfect love and mercy extended. Trust in the atonement of Christ and learn about the atonement of Christ. That's what I would say if I could speak out into the future.
All
and
right.
I'd probably be able to say a whole lot more than that, but time's limiting.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been fun. I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Gregorian Conversations podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. I love you, and I appreciate you being willing to spend a little time with me.
For sure. So,
thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.